Arambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Oh, good. Be seated, please. Parameshwara. Very good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Push the right button. Good, nice to see you all today. Welcome back, and welcome also to all the students watching online. We continue our study of chapter 13 of the Bhagavad Gita, Kshetrajna Yoga, and I'll remind you of the meaning of those words in a moment. Let's begin with some recitation, beginning with verse 8. And as always, when I'm chanting, be sure to read the translation and then repeat after me. Amanitvamadam bhitvam, amanitvamadam bhitvam, ahimsa kshantirarjavam, ahimsa kshantirarjavam, acharyopasanam shaucham, acharyopasanam shaucham, stharyamatma vinigraha, stharyamatma vinigraha, indriyarteshu vairagyam, indriyarteshu vairagyam, anahankara hevacha, anahankara hevacha, janma mrityu jara vyadhi, janma mrityu jara vyadhi, dukkha doshanudarshanam, dukkha doshanudarshanam, asaktiranabhishwangaha, asaktiranabhishwangaha, putradara graharishu, putradara graharishu, nityan cha samachittatvam, nityan cha samachittatvam, ishtanishtopapatishu, ishtanishtopapatishu, mayischananya yogena, mayischananya yogena, bhaktiravyavicarani, bhaktiravyavicarani, vivikta desha sevitvam, vivikta desha sevitvam, aratirjana samsari, aratirjana samsari. There we go. Adhyatma jnana nityatvam, adhyatma jnana nityatvam, tattva-jnanartha darshanam, tattva-jnanartha darshanam, etad-jnanamiti proktam, etad-jnanamiti proktam, ajnanam yaratonyatha, ajnanam yaratonyatha. My PowerPoint on, there we go. I got lost. Okay, one more verse. Jneyam yattat pravakshyami, jneyam yattat pravakshyami, yajñātvāmritam yajñātvāmritam anārimat param brahma, anadimat param brahma, na sattanna saruchyate, na sattanna saruchyate. Very good. Let us go back to verse 1. Verse 1, please. Because that's where we find the roadmap, as it were, for the entire chapter. If you remember in our introductory session on chapter 13, Arjuna began with 3 sets of questions, each question being twofold. Arjuna asked, what is prakritim, nature, and purusha, conscious being? Then he asked, what is kshetram, the field of experience, and kshetrajnam, the knower of the field of experience, the object and the knower of objects, object and subject, knower and known, and that was our last class, where we discussed that at great length. That was the first of the questions that Sri Krishna took up. And etad veditum echami, Arjuna said, this I want to know. Jnanam jnayam cha Keshava. Keshava, O Krishna, I want to know what is jnanam and jnayam, and that's our next topic. Jnayam is that which is to be known, the ultimate goal of spiritual practice, which is to discover. You can say it in 2 ways. We can say it is to discover your true divine nature, or here it's going to be Sri Krishna is going to put it in broader terms. It is to discover absolute reality, Brahman. So what is jnayam, what is to be known, is Brahman. We'll see that most likely in our next class. Today we're going to discuss what is jnanam. Generally, jnana means knowledge, but in this situation, it specifically means that which is required to get jnayam, that which is required to gain knowledge of Brahman, that which is required to discover your own true divine nature, that which is required in advance, which means we're talking about a step of preparation. And that's really our topic. If you notice, all of those verses that we just recited, we're all talking about values which are to be cultivated, and I'll talk about them in great detail in just a few minutes. All of those values are given by Sri Krishna because they're all necessary for the sake of becoming prepared for Brahmajnanam. Knowledge of Brahman, knowledge of reality. Without preparation, you won't go far in any endeavor in life. And let's be very specific. There's a little technical point here where it's really crucial to understand. And that is, to gain knowledge, you must first be prepared to gain that knowledge. There's certain steps of preparation. An example you may have heard me give before is, suppose you want to study calculus. I don't know why you'd want to study. They made me study when I was a young engineering student. Oh, we had to study so much advanced math that engineers would rarely, if ever, use. But anyway, it's all part of the training. But here's the point. Before you study calculus, there are certain prerequisites. You won't learn calculus unless you first studied trigonometry, and you won't understand trigonometry unless you first studied algebra, and you won't understand algebra unless you first studied mathematics. So you see, for any field of study, there are certain prerequisites. You might remember when you were in college, you wanted to take a course, and the course description, Calculus 401 or whatever it was, and then it listed several prerequisites which you had to have fulfilled before taking that particular class. By the way, I think calculus was a 101 class. It really pushed you right into it, if I remember correctly. Anyway, the point is that calculus is an advanced study, so you would expect there to be certain prerequisites. algebra, trigonometry, etc. Tell me, if calculus is an advanced study, what about gaining knowledge of Brahman? Off the charts, right? Not just advanced. It's not a 101 or a 401, it's a 1001 class. There are no such things. But if you remember the numbering system that many universities use, 101 is an introductory class, 401 is an advanced class, 601 I think would be for postgraduate. This is 1001 or even 1,000,001, meaning it's a very sophisticated study. And here's the point. To be prepared for an advanced class like calculus, you're going to require a fair amount of preparation. To become prepared for knowledge of Brahman, or we can express it differently, discovery of your true divine nature, Satchidananda Atma, for that kind of knowledge, it's extraordinary knowledge. For extraordinary knowledge, you require extraordinary preparation. That's the point. For extraordinary knowledge, for ordinary knowledge, ordinary preparation. For extraordinary knowledge, extraordinary preparation. One way in which that preparation is expressed is antakarana shuddhi. Shuddhi, purity of antakarana, of mind. Purity of mind. What exactly do we mean by purity of mind? Well, we missed the obvious. What is pure water? Just water. Which means any impurities have been removed, so that it's H2O and nothing else but water. So purity is arrived at through the removal of impurities. Antakarana shuddhi, purity of mind, is the result of removing mental impurities. What are those mental impurities? You'd be very surprised. Hurt is a mental impurity. Anger is a mental impurity. Irritation is a mental impurity. Hate is a mental impurity. Jealousy, mental impurity. These are impurities. They will not just impede, they block you in your effort to gain the highest knowledge. Suppose you study algebra but skip trigonometry before you go on to the calculus class, which means you have partial preparation. Will that work? It won't work even in an ordinary study like calculus, what to speak of this extraordinary pursuit that we're involved in here. What is required then is a very thorough and complete preparation of your mind so that you can proceed on this path of spiritual growth unfettered. In our meditation session, we were referring to Patanjali's Ashtanga, his 8 limbs of yoga, which began with yama and niyama. Yama, the moral prohibitions, don't lie, don't steal, don't hurt, and niyama, moral injunctions. You should engage in spiritual study, you should give charity, you should, etc. So in the meditation class earlier, I discussed how following yamas and niyamas are meant to help you live a conflict-free life. A conflict-free life so that your mind won't be distracted when you're trying to meditate. If you've just had a big argument with your spouse, sit and try to meditate. See how well your meditation will go right after a big argument. It won't go at all. Well, that's just one example of a conflict in life. To be able to meditate, you need a conflict-free life. which means follow these yamas and niyamas so you can live a conflict-free life. Here, in our present context, instead of Patanjali actually gives 5 yamas and 5 niyamas. What we're going to see here in the next 5 verses is a list of 20 values. These 20 values are meant to help you have a pure mind, a mind freed from obstacles, obstacles which will prevent you from making any progress on your life of spiritual growth. Let's just see the first verse. I think the first verse gives 9 of those 20 values. And then after the verse, we'll also discuss kind of more the general context. We'll discuss the first 9 values and also the general context. So let's go forward to verse 8. Yes. Amanitvamadambhitvam, amanitvamadambhitvam, ahimsa kshantirarjavam, ahimsa kshantirarjavam, acharyopasanam shaucham, acharyopasanam shaucham, stharyamatma vinigraha, stharyamatma vinigraha. I used to recite these verses when I was young. I've recited these verses every day. It was part of my routine, and for obvious reasons. As a young seeker on the path of Advaita Vedanta, I wanted to remove those obstacles, and I'll tell you, I had plenty. I had a lot of, what do they call it in school, where you lack the prerequisites, you have to do remedial work. So I had a lot of remedial work to do, and that's why I paid quite a bit of attention to these 5 verses. Also, in a few minutes, I want to tell you something special about my guru's treatment of these 5 verses. We'll talk about in just a few moments. Let's just see these first 9 values, and then we'll talk about it more in general. So the first one, amanitvam. Mani is one who thinks very highly of oneself. I am great. I've done this, I did that. And you all know people who are like that. Well, it turns out that kind of high regard for oneself is a problem. Not just, it's a problem in many ways. In a social context, such a person is often disliked for their pride. But on a more personal level, these are really meant to remove obstacles. Mana, this sense of pride, excessive pride, is a problem because if you think you are so great, then you're probably going to overlook your many problems. That's the issue. So you all know that there is such a thing as healthy pride. And healthy pride is important because if you don't have healthy pride, you don't have self-esteem. And someone who lacks self-esteem, who has so low self-esteem, that person is vulnerable to a variety of, to be honest, variety of forms of mental illness. Someone who has low self-esteem is vulnerable to problems like depression, etc. Healthy pride is I'm okay and you're okay. Unhealthy pride is I'm okay, but I'm not so sure about you. You get the point. Or better yet, you're normal, I'm great. Okay, this is the idea. And the problem with that, and what distinguishes this as being unhealthy and problematic, is that when you think you're great, you'll overlook your weak points. That's really the issue. The issue is not thinking you're great. Okay, think you're great. But to be blind to your many shortcomings, shortcomings which need attention, shortcomings which you have to address. How many prideful people are so focused on their greatness? I think of politicians when I talk about somehow many, there's a typical trait among many, but not all, politicians. By thinking you're great means you don't think about your weak points that need to be taken care of, need attention. So here the first of our 20 values is amanatvam, the absence of that pride. Then comes adambhitvam, which is even worse than pride. Pride is to be happy with all your qualities. Dambha is to be happy about qualities that you don't even possess. Is to think you're great and wonderful when you're absolutely the opposite. To overestimate yourself is dambha, or dambhitva, is the overestimation of yourself. A common translation is pretentiousness. To be pretentious is to pretend that you're more than you really are. So that's the sense of this pretentiousness. To be a dambhi is to almost like the English word dumb. How absurd it is to claim to have attributes and qualities that you simply don't have. To be pretentious is to pretend. And to pretend is to be disconnected from reality, from truth. To see yourself objectively is the goal. Objectively means I have many qualities and I have these shortcomings, I have these faults. These qualities I have, I need not be proud of because actually given by God, if I really understand whatever qualities I have, those qualities were given to me, given by parents, given by teachers, given by mentors, ultimately given by God, Ishvara. And so to have this excessive pride is silly. Also, whatever I possess, someone else possesses in much larger measure. No matter how accomplished you are, no matter how wise you are, no matter how wealthy you are, etc., somebody has those qualities to a far greater extent than you. So to be prideful or pretentious has no basis at all. Also though, objectivity means to see your good qualities objectively, without this excessive pride, but also to see your faults objectively. And here's the key. Many people, when they consider their faults, they're not objective about it. And they think, oh, I'm like this, oh, that's so bad, oh, and they conclude, I'm not a good person because I have this problem, I have that problem, I have the other problem. Therefore, and that's a problem, therefore, I am not a good person. Wrong conclusion. Absolutely wrong conclusion. Every great person has defects. They go together. And perhaps the best example we find in Scripture is the character of Bhishma, Pitamaha, who was arguably the greatest, or at least one of the greatest characters in the entire Mahabharata. He had some really huge blind spots, defects. His rigidity, and this is a perspective you may not have thought about. Many of you know the story well. I won't go into the details. But one defect he had was rigidity. He had made certain vows to his father. 3 vows he made to his father. A complicated story. You won't get into it. But he became so rigid about maintaining those vows that he caused a terrible war in which hundreds of thousands of warriors died. due to his rigidity. Now watch this. The fact that he was rigid doesn't mean he wasn't a great person. He was the greatest. Absolutely. He was, I would argue, in the whole Mahabharata, he is the greatest of the characters. But he had at least one defect, which is rigidity. This is life. We are all combinations of good traits and not so good traits. That's how human beings are. It's inevitable. There's no one who is 100% good, no one who is 100% bad. And the Mahabharata brings that out so brilliantly. It shows all the great people with defects. I've mentioned this before. Yudhishthira was addicted to gambling. And Duryodhana was not 100% bad. He had a real sense of loyalty, friendship, very strong. So, to look at ourselves objectively means not to elevate our good points, nor to narrowly focus on our defects. By narrowly focusing on our defects, we give ourselves a distorted self-image. If you focus on your defects, the example is if you take a little bug, put that little bug under a microscope. It looks like a monster, Rakshasa. So the point is that little bug is just a little nuisance. But when you put that little bug under the microscope, it looks horrible, frightening. Your problems, your defects are like those little bugs. They're nuisances, and they should be dealt with. You know, if there's a bug going around, get rid of the bug. If you have these little defects, you deal with them. Get rid of the little defects. But the point is, don't put your little defects under a microscope. We have a tendency of doing that, focusing in very narrowly on our mistakes, on our shortcomings. And to do that, we get a distorted self-image. So this distorted self-image has two sides. In this first two values, we're talking about the positive distortion, where you overestimate or overvalue your good points. But there's the other side also, where you where you elevate your negative points. You exaggerate your negative qualities, your mistakes, your defects. Both are harmful. We require in spiritual life, for the sake of antakarana shuddhi, you require an objective view of who and what you are as a human being. Objectivity is key. Then, third of the 20 values, ahimsa, harmlessness, a central value of the Hindu tradition. At least in, I think, 5 or 6 places in the Mahabharata, it says, ahimsa paramo dharmaha. The main value of dharma is ahimsa, not causing harm. And it truly is a central principle in Hindu dharma. All ethical and moral principles in the Hindu tradition are based in one way or the other on ahimsa. For example, something we've talked about before, but bears mentioning again, vegetarian diet is purely an expression of ahimsa. It is not that vegetarian diet is more pure than other food. So in India, you see the signboard. Shuddha Shakahari Kana. Shuddha. Pure vegetarian food. So by eating pure vegetarian food, you become more pure. Even though all the workers in that restaurant are underpaid and mistreated. Get the point? It's not what you eat that counts. In fact, you eat whatever you want. I don't care. Honestly, I don't care. The principle here is to live in such a way that you cause the least harm. That's the basic principle. Suppose the boss, I got to remember all these words, Malik, or Malik Ji, the head of the restaurant. Suppose he verbally abuses all of his employees while he eats his Shuddha Shakahari Khana, his pure vegetarian food. So notice he is not using his mouth to kill animals, but he's using his mouth to verbally hurt his employees. I would prefer that this fellow eat meat and stop using his mouth to hurt his employees. Anyway, you get the point. The basic principle is not purity of food. Vegetarian food in Hinduism is not like the dietary restrictions you find in Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So those are issues of purity, religious purity in those other traditions. You should eat certain foods, you shouldn't eat impure foods. In properly understood, there's nothing more pure about vegetables. There's nothing impure about animal flesh, except my guru would point out, if you leave the vegetables out on the counter for several days, they don't change much. You leave that animal flesh out for several days, it stinks. Anyway, that's his observation. Anyway, but the point here is we're not saying that one food is pure and another food is impure. The principle is one of Ahimsa, least harm. So the principle here is to live in such a way that causes the least harm. And this is a good place to point out here. We'll do it right now. One of the common misunderstandings about religious rules is that religious rules are to protect others. Religious and ethical rules are to restrain your behavior for the sake of protecting others. I think Karl Marx was famous for criticizing religion as being manipulative, controlling, and he rejected that. And that perspective, though, is a common misunderstanding of religions in general. When you see a list of religious prohibitions, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that, and then you realize that these prohibitions are being forced upon you for the sake of protecting others, to protect others from your bad behavior. This is a conventional view of religiosity, and it is 100% wrong. That's not the point here at all. You should live a dharmic life not for the sake of protecting others, it's for your own sake. This is where the mistake occurs. If you think that following all these prohibitions and injunctions are for the sake of protecting others, you've got it backwards. It's for the sake of helping you. When you go, and we discussed this in our meditation session, when you go contrary to the principles of Dharma, you place yourself in a state of conflict with others. You create conflict, and conflict works both ways. You not only create problems for the other person, but the other person creates problems For you become conflicted. Not only is the other person affected, when you go against principles of Dharma, you create conflict and difficulty for yourself. My guru was fond of saying to his metaphor, many of you have heard this, it's quite nice. He said, to rub up, this is his expression, to rub up against the laws of Dharma, he has said, is like rubbing up against a tree bark, with your bare arm. You rub your bare arm on this rough tree bark. You're rubbing, but you get rubbed back. And when you're done, not much happens to the tree bark, but your arm will be all scratched and bleeding. He used that metaphor to describe what happens when we rub up against moral and ethical norms. We rub up against others, they rub back. A good example of this is lawsuits. And many of you perhaps have been involved in some kind of lawsuit. I find it's really unfortunate, even when you are 100% in the right, you enter into the courtroom, it's just conflict, and that conflict affects you. Even though you're 100% in the right, you're rubbing up against someone else, you get rubbed back in the process. So the point to be made here is that these values, we've only seen 3 of the 20. Actually, I thought we'd get through all 20 today. I don't think so. That's okay. We're not in a hurry. The point, though, is if we fail to embrace these 20 values, we will find ourselves constantly in a state of conflict with others. And being in a state of conflict, in the earlier session I said your life becomes a mess. And if your life is a mess, when you sit down to meditate, you sit down in your mess. When you come here to study Bhagavad Gita, you bring your mess with you. Correct? Which is why it is so crucial to embrace these values. And just one more bit of overall comments, and then we'll go back to the list. And that was, my guru found such importance in this list of 20 values. He excerpted them from the Bhagavad Gita, taught them independently, and taught the value of values. So we can call these values amanitvam, absence of pride as a value, adambhitvam, absence of pretentiousness, ahimsa, absence of harm. These are all values to be cultivated. Why should we cultivate these values? Well, as I said a few moments ago, the conventional but wrong worldview is that you must, right? The wagging finger, the religious leader wags a finger. You must follow these values. Why? Because depending on the religious leader, if you don't, you will go to hell for all eternity. There are many, many, many religious leaders who will threaten you. If you don't do this, you will go to hell. Of course, Hindu teachers have the equivalent. If you don't do all this, you'll get reborn as a cockroach. Same thing. Those kinds of approaches, though, distort the original intent of these values. The original intent of these values is to help you live a better life. Who wants to live a life constantly in a state of conflict? How stressed out? you become when there's these big conflicts. I gave the example of a lawsuit before. How stressful it can be to go through all of that stuff. Or how stressful it is to have a messy life. You already know if you're, actually, people are a little different. Everyone has a different level of tolerance for mess. Some people can tolerate a messy desk. Other people can't tolerate. Some people can tolerate a messy house or a messy kitchen. Many can't tolerate. Many find it uncomfortable to be in that messy house, to be in that messy kitchen, or even to sit at that messy desk. To have a messy, conflict-ridden life will hold you back, not just in general, but especially in making progress on the spiritual path. As we said before, this is an extraordinary pursuit. For this extraordinary pursuit, there's some extraordinary preparation required. That extraordinary preparation includes an extraordinary degree of mental purity, antakarana shuddhi. So the purpose of these values then is to help you. And that's what my guru said. You have to recognize the value of the value. Specifically, you have to recognize that the value of the value is that it is valuable to me. When you recognize that the value is valuable to you, then and only then do you truly embrace the value. If you embrace a value because someone's wagging a finger at you, it means when they're not around wagging the finger, then the effect of that warning can go away. So if your embrace of values is outside directed, there's a lot of very profound philosophical discussion here, and let me not get into the details. But philosophers will make a distinction between having your values, your sense of your moral compass. Is your moral compass from the outside in or from the inside out? Outside in means you conform to societal expectations. Inside out means you have understood the value of these values and you act accordingly. So those who are outside in, conforming to societal expectations, those people are much more likely to make mistakes because their basis for the value is not strong. It depends on outside influences. But when you have internalized the value of the values, which is to say when you understand that these are valuable to you to help you live a conflict-free life so that your life is not a mess and so that you have the necessary antakarana shuddhi so that you can proceed on spiritual life. This is the assimilation of values, what my guru called the understanding or discovering the value of the values. Okay, let's see a few more values here. Next is kshantihi, the fourth value. Patience, tolerance, not getting so quickly irritated. So many times we find ourselves in an uncomfortable situation and we become irritated. Tell me, how does that irritation help? And you say, but Swamiji, I can't help it. You can. You say you can't help it. But tolerance is a skill we can cultivate. All of these values are meant to be cultivated. It's not that you're born with them. If you come from a really good family, you may be endowed with many good qualities. That's a real blessing. But in general, these values have to be cultivated deliberately. And how would you do that? Suppose you're in an irritating situation. You're at the supermarket. By the way, when was the last time I was in a supermarket? I don't even remember, but I can imagine. I'm sure they've changed a little bit over the decades. So anyway, whatever's going on there, it's not happening fast enough for you. You want to get checked out, you want to get out of there, and somebody is holding up the line, or something is going on, and you're late, and you're getting irritated, and is your irritation going to get you out of the store any quicker? No. In fact, it could actually escalate. Sometimes people get into arguments and all of this stuff, in which case a bad situation becomes even worse. My point here is that tolerance can be cultivated. You can't say, oh, Swamiji, I just get irritated, I can't do anything about it. Wrong assumption. Who said you can't do anything about it? You can. How? To remember the value of the value. When you remind yourself that getting irritated or impatient, not only is it not going to help anything, it's going to be harmful to you. To remind yourself of the value here being one of patience and accommodation, to remind yourself of the value helps you cultivate that value. Suppose each time you're in a situation where you find yourself impatient, you remind yourself of the value called patience. You remind yourself that being impatient isn't going to make anything go quicker. Secondly, it's only going to make you feel miserable. And if you remind yourself every time you become impatient, guess what? You cultivate patience. You cultivate kshantihi. Next comes arjavam. In Sanskrit, riju means rope, that which is straight. Not rope, straight is riju. Riju, the state of straightness is arjavam. Arjavam is a condition of being straight. Straight means do what you say, say what you do. That's the kind of straightness we're talking about here. Crookedness means someone will say one thing and do something else. Someone will do something else and say something else. This is problematic because it creates a conflict inside of you. You're saying one thing, you're doing something else. So to have some internal consistency and to stay with that is arjavam. And this so often comes out when these little lies we say, sometimes are referred to as white lies. Someone calls and you're on the phone. They say, okay. Suppose they get into a long conversation that you really don't want to deal with, and you say, oh, I'm sorry, I have to take care of this right now. Can we talk later? Now, it's a little lie told for the sake of getting yourself out of an uncomfortable situation, but it's still a lie. If you're in an uncomfortable situation, you can get yourself out without telling a lie. Just be a little bit more inventive, a little bit more creative. Find an appropriate way to tell the person, and a non-hurtful way to tell the person that you can't talk right now. You don't need to lie. Anyway, that lying is what causes this split between what you say and what you do. Next, acharya upasanam. Upasana means literally worship or reverence, acharya, of your teacher. Reverence of one's teacher, worship of one's teacher tell me, I'd be a little sarcastic, sorry. Does a teacher really want you to put flowers on their feet? Is that what teachers want? A teacher wants you to understand. The best way to worship or respect a teacher is to understand. They want you to understand, not put flowers on the feet. Anyway, I won't. Enough said. Okay. By the way, in certain groups where that is practiced, it's not done for the sake of the guru. So there is such a thing in this tradition of pada puja, to do worship of the guru's feet. Oftentimes on Guru Purnima, the guru sits there and the devotees will do puja to the guru's feet, including offering flowers, everything as if the guru's feet were a deity on the altar. I'm not saying that's wrong at all, but I am saying it's not for the guru's sake. The guru, as I said, the guru doesn't want you to put flowers at the feet. The guru wants you to understand. However, many people are deeply engaged in certain practices of bhakti, certain devotional practices. And some people who are deeply engaged in these devotional practices find the idea of pada puja very beautiful, very meaningful, wonderful. So if it is beautiful and meaningful for the student to do that pada puja, wonderful. It's a great practice. But keep in mind, that too is for the student's sake, not for the teacher's sake. From the teacher's standpoint, what's desirable is not flowers, what's desirable is understanding. Enough said. Next, the seventh of our 20 values, shaucham, purity. Purity is always described in a twofold way. One is pretty obvious, external purity, take a bath every day, but the internal purity is much more significant. It's pretty easy to wash the skin. What about mind and heart? With a group of children, I ask, suppose you're so sad. What can you do to wash the sadness away? Can you pour soapy water in your ear? Children thought that was really cute. Anyway, you get the point. It's pretty easy to soap away external impurities, but for the internal ones, it's much more difficult. And sadness and hurt and jealousy, these are great examples of impurities. They need to be removed. How to remove, first of all, how to remove, first is the value of the values. You have to recognize that removing these mental impurities is valuable to you. For example, sometimes people will talk about hurt, and they'll say that, or resentment. And they'll say, look what that person did to me. Of course I'm hurt. Of course, they deserve my anger. They deserve my resentment. Look what they did. So what? They did what they did. It's an already, what do they call it? Done deal. It's an already done deal. It's a fact in the past. In the present moment, you are full of hurt and resentment and anger. Those are forms of mental impurities, and those mental impurities are harmful to you. So, to overcome hurt, anger, and resentment is not dependent on the other person. You don't have to wait for them to apologize. Doesn't depend on their apology. They probably don't think they did anything wrong in the first place. Don't wait for their apology. Recognize the value of the value, and here it's to recognize that hurt, resentment, and anger are harmful to you. then you find ways to deal with all that. Prayer is a great way to deal with all that. Meditation can help. If it's really severe, talk it out with a friend, talk it out with a therapist, if that's helpful. But don't allow that hurt, anger, and resentment to fester within. That's the problem of shuchi, the lack of shuchi, the impurity within. Then, sthairiyam, steadfastness. And this is especially true on being on a spiritual path. Requires this dedication. And over the years, many times we see someone start coming to classes, and initially they seem very enthusiastic, and then after 3-4 classes, you don't see them again. So what happens? Not surprising, it happens. This happens quite frequently. People start with enthusiasm, and that enthusiasm wanes very rapidly, not just with regard to spiritual things, but anything in life. Have you ever started a exercise regime and it lasts for about 3 or 4 days? Or a diet? Good examples. You can start off, look at that, you have a value for the diet, you have a value for the exercise regime, but then after several days or weeks, it goes away. Why? Can you get the answer, right? You have a value, but you don't have a sufficient value. If you had a sufficiently strong value for that exercise regime or the diet, if your value were so strong, you wouldn't have dropped it after a few days or weeks. So something that gets dropped, generally gets something valuable that gets dropped, is dropped because you don't see the value of it. And that certainly applies in spiritual life. To the extent that you see the value of these teachings, you will make it a focus, not the focus, but a focus of your life. You will continue to pursue all of this when you see the value. So it's another example of finding the value of the value. It's not that you should practice, you should engage yourself in spiritual practices. This word should is that wagging finger, and as I said before, it's a very weak external basis for making decisions in life. Decisions should be made based on your own internalized value system. To the extent that you recognize the value of these teachings, to that extent you will be steady, you will have sthairiyam, firmness. Then Atma Vinigraha. Here Atma doesn't mean Ch.13. Atma simply means oneself or one's mind. Vinigraha, control, self-control. Obviously you can't control Ch.13. Atma, that's not what it means. You have to control yourself. Control what you say, control what you do. How often do we say something or do something and later regret what we've said or did? How to cultivate self-control. And notice I said it's cultivated. Sorry to keep dwelling on this point, but these values are not something you either have or don't have. These values need to be cultivated in our lives. Self-control can be cultivated. How do you cultivate self-control? If you say the wrong thing, after the fact you think, oh, I said the wrong thing. Next time, I'm going to be more careful. All right? Next time, you still say the wrong thing. But then, after a shorter period of time, you catch yourself. Oh, I said the wrong thing again. First time it took you a day to remember, oh, I said the wrong thing. Second time it takes you a couple of hours. Oh, I said the wrong thing. Third time, and it happens again and again, I said the wrong thing, and then you catch yourself a minute after, 1 minute after. Fourth time, you're saying the wrong thing, and you say, why am I saying the wrong thing? You catch yourself in the act, and guess what? The next time, you catch yourself a moment before. It's a matter of self-observation, self-discipline. This self-discipline, actually put it the other way around. It is self-discipline, but notice this self-discipline is cultivated through self-observation. And let me give you, this would be maybe an appropriate way to conclude our class today, and that is to empower you with one technique of helping you cultivate these values. Specifically, it's a technique meant to help you cultivate self-awareness. Self-awareness at a psychological level, because we're talking about the mind right now. We're not talking, this is more of a psychological topic. In the Bhagavad Gita, we find many psychological topics. Perhaps it's one of the many reasons the Bhagavad Gita is so popular. It includes not only spiritual topics, but many psychological topics, as is this whole topic, which is dealing with Antakarana Shuddhi, purity of mind. It's a psychological topic. Emotional growth and the removal of these mental impurities can be fostered with one basic technique. And the basic technique is a technique of self-awareness. And here we go. The technique, and by the way, I've practiced this most of my adult life. And that is, whatever you do, you ask yourself, why am I doing it? Why did I do it? So whatever action you're engaged in, you reflect on that action and say, what is the reason I'm doing this? And sometimes it's very pragmatic. It's very simple. So you're at the sink washing dishes. So you ask yourself the question, why am I doing dishes? Most of the time, the answer will be very simple and straightforward, because to get clean dishes. But many times, we do things for non-obvious reasons. We feel pressured inside. Oh, I have to do this. Why? A very common example of pressure. If I don't do this, what will they think? It's a very common problem. If I don't do this, if I don't dress like this, if I don't behave like this, if I don't do this, what will they think? To recognize that you are acting for the sake of social approval is an excellent example of this practice of self-awareness. Now, please don't misunderstand me. Am I telling you that you shouldn't conform to what other people expect? I'm not saying that. Whether you conform or don't conform is a decision for you to make. And that's not our discussion here and now. You do what you think is right. And that's absolutely fine. The problem I'm talking about is that we do things without thinking about why we're doing them. So you conform to other people's expectations without thinking about the fact that you're not doing it for yourself, you're doing it to conform to their expectations, and to be aware of this fact leads you to more inner maturity, more understanding, more alertness, more awareness at a psychological level, this leads to emotional growth. This leads to the growth of this antakarana shuddhi. It is the self-observation, self-awareness. The more you observe your behavior and ask yourself that question, why am I doing this? This very practice can transform your life. It can. But, and there's an important but we have to add here, and that is, when we ask ourselves these questions, become self-reflective and self-aware, there's a tendency some people have to become very self-critical. If you observe yourself a lot, you'll probably end up observing a lot of your mistakes, a lot of your shortcomings, a lot of your problems, and to observe your mistakes and problems is a very good thing, very important. It will help you come up in spiritual life, but it becomes a huge problem if you allow yourself to become overly self-critical. If you become overly self-critical, it starts to pull down your self-esteem. And as I said before, with low self-esteem, then you end up depressed and you're going in the opposite direction. Instead of on a path of growth, you're going on a path of depression. So let's be very clear. This process of self-observation that I've described, to constantly observe yourself and understand, why am I doing this, or why am I not doing that? That process of observation is crucial for your inner growth as long as it's done in an objective manner. We had that discussion at the beginning of the class. If you turn self-observation into an occasion for self-criticism, to me, self-criticism is like taking a stick and hitting yourself in the head. Now, you wouldn't do that because it injures your body, but tell me, when you are overly self-critical, oh, I'm such an idiot, I'm such a klutz, why am I so stupid? Those statements are the verbal equivalent to hitting yourself. I think this is an important point. To hit yourself is harmful. To say, why am I such an idiot, is equally harmful. To hit yourself hurts your body. To say, why am I such an idiot, hurts your self-esteem. Both are equally harmful. Stop it! No one needs to tell you to stop hitting yourself, but someone might need to tell you, don't put yourself down. Self-criticism is not self-observation. Does this help you? Hitting yourself in the head with a stick? How does that help you? In the same way, saying, what an idiot I am, how does that help you? It doesn't help at all. It only hurts. So, to finish this up, this practice of self-observation, to watch yourself very carefully. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? Why am I not doing something else? That process is so valuable. That practice is so valuable as long as it's done without self-criticism. Self-criticism has no role at all in a life of spiritual growth. Just like hitting yourself in the head with a stick isn't helpful, in the same way, self-criticism isn't helpful. Objectively recognizing your shortcomings and working to overcome them, that's helpful. But putting yourself down in any way whatsoever is only harmful. And some people get into a bad habit of doing that. Those habits need to be broken. There's no place for self-criticism in a life of spiritual growth. Okay, enough said. So we've made it through 9 of the 20 values. I thought we'd finish today, not even close, and that's okay. We're not in a hurry. Maybe next time we will finish this section of 20 values. We'll see that next week. I've been forgetting to remind you that we've restarted our Vedanta class on Tuesday nights. It's a wonderful class. You will see why Shankaracharya is revered as such a great teacher. That will become so obvious. We're studying this Upadesha Sahasri. It's a brilliant text. So please come join us on Tuesday evenings for the Vedanta class. You can catch up on the other classes online if you want to. Also, I'll mention that each week we continue to publish our Bhagavad Gita dramatic reenactment, and this coming Thursday we'll publish Chapter 13, the same chapter we're studying, so you can get the sneak preview on Thursday by watching that video. Very good. We will conclude today's class with our brief prayers at the altar. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shrinvan Uttabasira Saranam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyaptate Haya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadguru Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat.